ॐ नमो नारायणाय ॐ नमो नारायणाय
Asmad Gurubhyo Namaha, Asmad Parama Gurubhyo Namaha, Asmad Sarva Gurubhyo Namaha. So today we're continuing on with our discussion of the book, The Greatness of Saranagati or Surrender in Sri Vaishnavism by Dr. C. Umakantan. So chapter 1, the nature and destiny of the soul. The nature and destiny of the soul is the noblest of all investigations. The Vishishta Dvaita means holistic non-dualism, right? Or it could also mean non-specific or specified or specific non-dualism, right? Which is the explanation of the Vedantic philosophy of Ramanuja, which has had a hoary antiquity, focused its attention because it even was there before Vishishta Dvaita was being preached, even before Ramanuja. Ramanuja himself cites different sages who had this outlook, this Vedantic outlook, Guhadev, Karpardin, Tanka, Brahmida, Bodhayana. There are these different sages who also, in fact, Ramanuja went to Kashmir to look at Bodhayana's commentary on the Vedanta Sutras. So anyway, Vishishta Dvaita has been around for a long time. Ramanuja himself was 1,000 years ago. So even before that, people were preaching this understanding of reality, Vishishta Dvaita. So it has a hoary antiquity, focused its attention and reasoning on the subject of meaning and purpose of man's life. The sages and philosophers of India were profoundly interested in the study of what soul is, or what the soul is, and what it should aim at. So these are common philosophical questions. Who am I, and what is this life meant for? What is the goal of life? So the concept of soul plays an important role in the Indian philosophical tradition. The entire edifice of Indian philosophy is based on the soul. And he's using the word soul here. In Sanskrit, we use the word Atman to mean the individual self. There are different types of Atman. There's also the Paramatman, which means God, the supreme self. And so soul or self is taken here to mean the individual soul, which is different from the supreme soul or the the supreme self. So some of the important questions that originate in this context are: what is the nature of the soul? Is the soul many or one? Did souls exist independently, or do they depend on the supreme soul being their modes, or being an expression of the supreme soul in some way, or related? How do they relate to the supreme soul? So the whole study of Vedanta is about the soul and how it relates to the other two realities, that is the universe and God. So such questions are discussed threadbare from the dawn of Indian philosophical inquiry. Different schools of Indian philosophy held different views of self or soul in tune with their metaphysical presuppositions. The Charvaka school, Charvaka is the Indian school of atheism, an atheistic school, holds the view that there is no such thing as an immutable self, spiritual in nature, over and above the body. So this is a materialist point of view. So if we want to talk about materialism, Charvaka is the rishi, or we can't say rishi because he wasn't really spiritual, but he is the philosopher that his philosophy was materialism or atheism, Indian atheism. According to them, self is nothing but the name given to the body, made up of four ultimate elements, namely earth, water, fire, and should be air, but looks like we might have lost a page here in the introduction. The pages 12 and 13 are missing. So we're Presumably, he's talking about people who do believe in the soul, not the Charvakas, but he was originally starting to talk about the Charvakas. So it is. So we're talking about the soul here. It is distinct from the body, senses, and mind, manas. Bondage is due to ignorance and karma. So ignorance is understandable. It's in Sanskrit, that's called ajnana. Karma means actions. Liberation is due to knowledge and the destruction of karma, or the destruction of the fruits of actions. So the next one, he's talking about different philosophical schools that deal with this subject. The next one, Sankhya, or it's a system called Sankhya, which means more or less enumeration or counting, right? It's a system where they talk about empirical science. Believes in two realities, Purusha and Prakriti. Purusha meaning the Lord. Purusha, it means the conscious, and Prakriti, the unconscious, or matter. Purusha is self and spirit. It is the subject as well as the knower. According to them, the existence of self can be proved by having the feeling of one's own undoubted nature that we all have selves. It exists and survives because it is self-manifest. It is different from mind, body, and senses, brain, and conscious states. It is a conscious spirit and the subject of knowledge, and never an object of knowledge. Ultimately, it is a pure consciousness as such, and consciousness is its essence and not a quality. When one who knows the difference between Purusha and Prakriti one who knows the difference between the two will attain liberation. That's according to the Sankhya philosophy. That means the knowledge of difference between Purusha and Prakriti itself is moksha. Moksha meaning liberation, which is the goal. Not like the Nyayayikas. Nyayika school is the school of logic. The Mimamsaka means the Karmakandis or the Purva Mimamsas. The Mimamsa means deliberation, right? So, like the Nyayayikas, the logicians, and the Mimamsakas, the deliberators, are pluralists and realists. They believe in plurality of souls and of the universe, and they also believe that the world and the souls have a real existence separate from God. They believe in the reality of the self. The self is eternal, infinite, and the substratum of consciousness. To them, the consciousness is not an essence of the self. They believe in the plurality of selves and the law of karma, and an unseen power, or apurva. They call it apurva. After liberation, the self remains as a pure substance without any consciousness and bliss. So that's the Mimamsaka's idea, near the Karmakandis. So Purva Mimamsa, or the first type of deliberation on Karmakanda, and then Uttara Mimamsa is the next school called Vedanta. So now we're going to talk about the Vedanta schools. Now, the first school he's going to talk about is Advaita. Advaita means non-dualism, which believes in the ultimate unreality of the soul, the individual souls and the universe of matter, but believes that only one thing exists, one homogeneous thing called Brahman, or the Supreme Spirit. So here he's going to describe that. In Advaita, there is only one supreme reality, who is none other than Brahman, the great one, or the great spirit, like that. The Jiva, or the Jivatman, the individual self, is nothing but the reflection of Brahman, the Supreme Spirit, right? Conditioned by avidya. So the idea in Advaita is that the Supreme somehow or other becomes conditioned by ignorance, avidya, and by being conditioned, part of it becomes conditioned by ignorance, and that part thinks itself to be separate from the whole. And then that's what we call the individual soul. So that's what the Advaitins believe. And they believe that once the individual realizes that he's actually a part of the whole, he gives up his individualness and becomes part of the whole again. So the jiva, in its empirical level, has three coats or three sheaths, three layers around it. It has the stula sharira, the shukshma sharira, and the karna sharira. So the stula sharira means the gross body. The shukshma sharira means the subtle body, right? So gross body is made of flesh and blood. The subtle body is the mind, the intelligence, the ego. These are all described in Bhagavad Gita. And the karna sharira means the causal body. So the stula sharira is identified as the food coat. Anamaya. If you in the Taittiriya Upanishad, it talks about Anamaya and different sheaths. Okay, so stula sharira is identified as the food coat. The shukshma sharira is identified with mind, consciousness, and finally the karna sharira, or the causal body, is identified with the covering of bliss, because the soul is said to have bliss. So the cycle of births and deaths relates to the stula sharira only. So only the physical body, says here, according to Advaita, the physical body dies. This sharira is the linkage between one janma and the next janma, between one birth and the next birth, right? So when jnana, actually, I would say, personally, I would say it's the shukshma sharira. It's the consciousness, which is the link between one birth and the other, not the physical body. But he's saying that here, so it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. When jnana or knowledge emerges, ajnana will be dispelled in the jiva. So when knowledge arises, ignorance is destroyed, obviously. Then there is an end to the cycle of births and deaths. Right? So in Advaita, they say, jnanat mokshaha. From knowledge comes liberation. So at this stage, avidya is also completely extinguished. And finally, stula, or the gross, and shukshma, or the subtle, shariras, bodies, are dropped away. And the jiva itself, right, will cease to be the jiva and be raised to the original state and merge back into the Brahman. So this is the idea of Advaita. There are a lot of fallacies in that idea that contains a small amount of truth, but in general, there are a lot of fallacies in that idea, because for an example, if Brahman is everything, so where does this avidya come from? Where does this force that affects it and makes it think that it's this little parts or little individual soul? Where does that come from? Right? So they say this is ajnana or ignorance, or it's called maya, illusion. So this ajnana or ignorance, is it real or is it not real? If we say it's real, then it's something separate from Brahman. If we say it's unreal, then how can it affect Brahman? So the problem with Advaitins is that when you pose these questions to them, they're unable to answer. So they just simply say, it cannot be described by words. It's such a great philosophy that we can't actually describe it. This is a nonsense answer. And so Advaita is very easily defeated. But in any case, he is mentioning it here because it is one of the schools of Vedanta. Now we get to Vishishta Dvaita. According to the Vishishta Dvaita school of thought, Ramanuja's thought, the soul is in Sankhya, the soul as in Sankhya, because the Sankhya system also agrees that there is an individual soul, is different from 24 categories of Prakriti, right? So there are these 24 other things: earth, water, fire, air, ether, the mind, intelligence, ego, the working senses, the knowledge acquiring senses, etc. So tanmatras, which are in between the senses and the elements. So there is a system of creation which is spoken about in the Sankhya school, which he hasn't described here in full, because the book is not about Sankhya. It's not about these other schools like Advaita or Sankhya, or even the logicians or the Mimamsikas. It's not about that. It's about Saranagati, or surrender, in Sri Vaishnavism. So to get to the point of Sri Vaishnavism, he had to work up in the first few paragraphs talking about the other schools of Indian philosophy. So it says, in the school of Vishishta Dvaita, as also in many other Vaishnava schools, because there are other Vaishnava schools like the Gaudiya Vaishnava school, the Madhva Vaishnava school, the Nimbarka Vaishnava school, the Vallabha Vaishnava school. There are these, the Ramanandi Vaishnava school. So there are many. So all of those schools believe in the reality of the soul, the individual soul as a separate entity. So it says here, it is one of three reals, of three realities, or three tattvas, or three principles. So there are three Vedantic principles, or tattvas, according to Vishishta Dvaita and according to many of the other Vedantic schools too. They are Chid, Achit, and Ishvara, right? So the soul, the universe, and God. Chit, Achit, and Ishvara, right? So it is one of these three reals, the other two being Brahman and Prakriti, right? So Brahman, I just call Brahman Ishvara, right? That's just another name. It means God and or the complete supreme controller. And Prakriti or Achit is Jada or insentient matter, right? So there are these three realities. There are these three principles in the universe, and that the relationship between them is what makes the difference between the different Vaishnava schools. But all the Vaishnava schools agree that there are these three principles. All right. So now Prakriti, or material nature, otherwise known as Achit or Jada, right, is composed of 5 elements or bhutas. These are called the Pancha Mahabhutas, right? So they are five elements. 5 elements means earth, water, fire, air, ether, right? Then we have 5 subtle elements, right, called tanmatras, right? Then we have 5 sense organs, or panchindriyas, right? And 5 motor organs. So we have the 5 knowledge acquiring senses and 5 senses of action. Then we have manas, buddhi, and ahankar. Manas means mind, buddhi means intelligence, ahankar means ego. So the soul, so if we add those up, we've got 5 and 5 is 10, and another 5 is 15, and another 5 is 20, plus manas, buddhi, ahankar, 23, right? So we have pancha, 20 plus 3. There was, I'm not sure. There must be another, there was another one in there somewhere. And we get 20, the soul being the 25th category. So it is spiritual. The soul itself is spiritual, whereas Prakriti and its modifications, these other things, are material. So that's the first thing. First of all, Free Vaishnavism, Vishishta Dvaita, we, as with other Vaishnava schools, we believe that there's a reality to the universe, there's a reality to the individual selves. The individual selves, the difference between that and matter is that the individual selves are spiritual, right? They're called chit, or consciousness, or knowledge, right? And the achit, or the jada, the insentient matter, is material. It's has no consciousness. So the soul, or the self, according to Vishishta Dvaita, is ontologically different from Brahman on the one hand and matter on the other. So it stands in between. It's not material and it's also not God. It's the soul is there in the middle. It has some qualities, or some qualities in some degree that Ishvara has, that God has. It's spiritual in nature, but it's also not. It's not the supreme being. So the fact that it is different from Brahman should not be understood as it is independent from Brahman. So, okay, so he says it's different. The individual souls are different from the supreme soul, right? From the supreme Lord, God, right? But that doesn't mean they're not also dependent upon him. They're dependent upon him. In fact, even the universe of matter and the souls are all dependent on God. The soul is a body of Brahman. Okay, so this is one of Ramanuja's ideas, which is also there in the scripture. It's called Sharira Shariri Bhava. That God is everything, in a sense, because he pervades everything from the inside and the outside. And everything that exists is like a body. And within the body, there are, just like within our body, we have a soul, and we have a mind, and we have We have a subtle body. Inside our gross body, we have a subtle body and we have a soul. Right? So similarly, within the universe, or within all of existence, exists the souls and matter, right? And so Brahman, or the Supreme, which is everything, is considered to be like the body of creation, of existence. So the soul is a body of Brahman. While the body is controlled and governed by the soul is controlled and governed by Brahman, right? Okay, so the difference is, in this analogy, is that our body is controlled by the soul. The soul thinks, feels, and wills, and gets our body to do different things, right? Whereas we think, feel, and will, but we can't make the whole universe change, right? So it's God, who is everything, who controls us and supports us. So in the sense of the soul supporting the body, God is the support. God is the support, and the soul, the individual soul, is the thing which is supported and controlled. Whereas in the analogy of the body, our body, right, it's the soul which supports the body. If the soul leaves the body deteriorates and it's useless. Whereas the universe, everything that exists, is God. So therefore, he is controlling that from outside, whereas we are controlling our own body from inside. So the soul is a body of Brahman. While the soul is a body of Brahman, sometimes the material nature is considered to be personified and is named as Devi or Durga. Okay, but that is not to be confused. But here we're just talking about insentient matter. So we're not talking about any personality that represents that or controls that matter, right? So that would be a devata called Durga or Devi. So the soul is a body of Brahman, while body is controlled, right, and governed by the soul. The soul is controlled and governed by the Supreme Brahman or Ishvara. The Vishishta Advaita distinguishes from the body and sense organs from the mind, right? Vishishta Advaita distinguishes the soul from the body and from the sense organs, and the sense organs from the mind. As already stated, Charvaka, the Indian atheist school, right, or materialist school, equates the soul or consciousness with the body. So the Vishishta Advaita school does not accept the Charvaka point of view. So this is the first thing that we disagree, is we disagree that we are the body. We say, no, we are the Atman, we are the soul, we are the self within the body. So according to the former, the Vishishta Advaitins, the Sri Vaishnavas, right, the soul cannot be identified either with any one part of the body or with all the parts of the body put together. The body being inert, right, it can never generate consciousness, which constitutes the essence of the soul. As the consciousness, right, in Sanskrit consciousness, the word consciousness is Chaitanya, is essentially different from matter. It cannot be derived from matter. You can't derive something completely different. For example, if I want to make an apple pie, I have to have apples. I can't make an apple pie if I don't have apples. So the soul and matter are completely different things. One's material, one is spiritual, and so therefore one cannot be derived from the other. So you can't derive life from matter. Right? The soul cannot be created from matter. The presence of consciousness in man, therefore, is different from body and matter, or matter. Hence, according to Vishishta Advaita school, the consciousness is the same as the soul or self or Atman. Okay. The Nyayikas, or the logicians, believe that consciousness is only an accidental property of the self that arises in it under certain conditions. So they say that if you put a certain amount of things together, somehow consciousness just spontaneously occurs. So we don't agree with that. The self, according to them, is essentially unconscious. The consciousness originates in the self when it's brought into relation with the external objects through the mind and senses. When it is severed of such relations with the external world or with the internal world, the mind, it remains unconscious. So they say if you take away the body, if you take away the mind, then the soul is there, but the soul is not conscious. Right. So that's that. We don't agree with that at all. The soul, the essence of the soul is consciousness. So, as against the Nyayikas or the logicians, the followers of Vishishta Advaita hold the view that the self is essentially conscious. It is self-luminous. What does that mean by self-luminous? If I have a lamp, if I have a dark room, I can't see anything. But if I have a lamp and I light the lamp, I can not only see everything in the room, but I can also see the lamp. So the consciousness of the soul illuminates itself. In Europe, the philosopher Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." He realized that because he could think about himself, therefore he must exist. He must exist as a separate entity, right? Because he was conscious. So when we become conscious of things around us, but we also become conscious of ourselves, self-conscious. So not when someone is conscious, they're not just conscious of other things, they're conscious of themselves also. So self-consciousness is a quality of the soul. It is self-luminous, right? It illuminates or throws knowledge onto itself, guides the body and senses and mind in their actions. It is for this reason that Vishishta Advaita believes that the self, which is conscious and blissful, needs to be kept apart from the body or matter, which is devoid of consciousness and bliss. So that's very simple, right? So the soul, when it's associated with the body, is what we see in this world of happiness, distress, old age, and disease. We see samsara, we see this cycle of birth and death. Only when the souls are associated with matter, when they're in subtle matter, or when they're covered by these sharira, shukshma sharira, stula sharira, shukshma sharira, the gross and subtle bodies. Right? Otherwise, if they're not covered by that, then when they're totally, completely uncovered, the soul is pristine and completely pure and is eternally happy, and there is no ignorance and there is no lack to its bliss. Right? So if for this reason that Vishishta Advaita believes that the self, which is conscious and blissful, needs to be kept apart from the body and matter. But how do you do that? How do you extract the soul from the body, from the subtle body and the gross body, and have it just stay by itself? That is called moksha. That is called liberation. So this view of Vishishta Advaita is also enlightened in Bhagavad Gita. So in Bhagavad Gita, there are many different processes which are taught by Lord Krishna to Arjuna about how to free the self from the body and mind, and to ultimately have the self be in its pristine, in its essential nature, without any covering of this stula and shukshma sharira, or the gross and subtle bodies. Right? So then it's in a completely eternal, full of bliss and full of knowledge situation, which is called liberation or moksha or mukti. According to Vishishta Advaita, the soul is different from sense organs. It should be understood that the sense organs, right, are only the channels of knowledge and consciousness, and are not by themselves the nature of knowledge and consciousness. Right? Sense organs being parts of the body, material in nature, they cannot generate consciousness or knowledge. The soul, which is of the nature of consciousness, works through these channels of knowledge and obtains knowledge of the objects of the world. Okay, so what's an example of that? My eye and my eye sees something, and my eye is an organ of sight. So I have sight, which is a sense organ, right, through my eyes, and I see something, and that impression of that thing, the recognition of that thing, is therefore comes into my mind, and therefore my soul, myself, can understand that there is such a thing. There is such a thing out there, and I'm perceiving it through my senses. through the sense organs. But the sense organs themselves cannot create knowledge. They're simply conduits, right, for that knowledge. They could also be faulty. Sense organs be faulty. I can have, if I take my glasses off, then I can't read. If I put my glasses on, I can read. So I need the glasses because my eyes have some fault from old age. So the soul is to be demarcated from the mind. The mind is only a karna or a cause or an instrument of knowledge, and never a karta or a doer, right? Which is the soul, or jnata or knower, a doer or knower. Whereas the soul is a doer and a knower. Further, the mind being an evaluated sattvic is non-eternal. Is this, we have the right thing here? This is 16 and 17. Okay. Of sattvic, yeah, his English is not all that good. So he says here, further, mind being an evaluate of sattvic. The word sattvic means the mode of goodness, the mode of nature, which is goodness. It is non-eternal, whereas the soul is eternal. So he's just saying here that the mind is non-eternal. The soul is also different from the pranas. What are pranas? Pranas are life airs. So the pranas, or the vayu visheshas, vishesha means specific winds, specific winds in the body, or vayu visheshas, or a particular type of vayu or air. We cannot attribute consciousness to them. On the other hand, the soul, being spiritual, is of the nature of consciousness. The consciousness cannot be attributed to the pranas, either singularly or collectively. Therefore, the self, which is the essence of consciousness, is different from the pranas. Okay, so he's just, what he's doing here is a process which is called neti, na iti in Sanskrit. Means not that, not that. We can find out what something is by saying it's not that, it's not that, it's not that. If I saw an animal and somebody said, what kind of animal can you see? You know, somebody else who can't see the animal is asking me to describe the animal. And I said, well, I don't really know what it is, but it's not a horse. It's not a cow. It has 4 legs, but it's not a horse. It's not a cow. It's not a, and I go through all the things it isn't, then eventually I will understand what it is. When all of the other ideas have been discredited, I will come to the correct answer. So this is called neti. So he's saying here that the soul is also not the pranas. It's not the mind. It's not the senses. It's not the pranas. Right? Therefore, the self, which is the essence of consciousness, is different from the pranas. The self is both doer and enjoyer of the fruits of his deeds. This is evident from the views of the Brahma Sutras, which are the systematic explanation in very short verses of the Upanishads in the Vedas. That the self is an agent. The self is a doer, karta, an agent. It must be, however, noted that the doership of the soul is subordinate to the supreme Brahman. This does not mean that Brahman deprives the soul of its free will, or the soul is not responsible for its actions. Despite the fact that Brahman, or the supreme person, Ishvara, God, space and time are involved in the doership of the soul, they are only causes in general and not in particular, right? So if I have a desire, my soul has a desire, and I go and I do something, yes, I need the help of the Supreme Lord to help me to do that, to acquiesce and to let me do that. I also need some help from material things, but it's my desire, and therefore I have to suffer or enjoy the results of that, which is called karma, the fruits of karma. So karma of each one constitutes the specific cause of actions of each soul. So the cause of actions is previous karmas. So when we perform karma, we perform some action, we get a result of that action, and that action impels us to perform another action, a concomitant action after that. Thus, the Brahman, or the Supreme Lord of Vishishta Dvaita, cannot be ascribed partially or wholly, right? We cannot ascribe to God, right, the cause of our actions. Okay? So, following the scriptures, the Vishishta Dvaitins opine that the self, or the soul, is of the nature of truth, knowledge, and infinite. So, infinity, knowledge, and bliss, right? Truth. So, Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma. This is a statement in the Upanishads. So, it is of the nature, consciousness, the self knows itself, right? Self-knowledge. It is not in need of another consciousness to know it. The Vishishta Dvaitins distinguish two types of consciousness, namely consciousness by which one it appends itself, called dharmi jnana, right? Consciousness by which it appends itself, so consciousness of things around it, and then also the consciousness through which the soul apprehends all other things. So there's dharmi jnana, where he understands itself, and dharma bhuta jnana, where it understands all other things. Hence, the soul is described as self-luminous and not subjected to the origination and destruction. So the self is eternal. It has no beginning or end, and it's eternal. It is also immutable. Cannot be cut. We know this from Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2. It explains all about this. So, like Sankhya, or epistemological science, right? The Vishishta Dvaita admits the plurality of souls. There are many, many souls. There are, in fact, an unlimited number of souls. There are as many souls in the world as there are psycho-organisms. I don't know what he means exactly by that, but he means there's many, 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 many souls. There's unlimited souls. The Vishishta Dvaitins argue that if there is only one self, which is what the Advaitins say, that there's just one self, there's not a lot of selves, then pain and pleasure of one would result in the pain and pleasure of another, right? So if there's only one soul, and you have it and I have it, then if I touch myself, then you should feel me touching myself, because the soul, if it's just one soul, it'll feel the same, all the senses of all the different bodies. So this is of course nonsense, right? One's birth and death would lead to the birth and death of all. One's liberation would lead to the liberation of all, right? If we're all the same soul. So this is not a good doctrine. So as this is not the case, it is believed that the selves are many, right? This is otherwise called samasta vachakam, samasti vachakam. Samasti means ordinary observation or statement here. As if one points out grain, it means a bag of grain, right? So if I simply say that's grain, that's rice, and what does it mean? It's a heap of rice, or it's a bag of rice. Likewise, though souls are many, which is called jatyeka vachakam. So I'm not sure exactly what he means there. The souls, however, are plural, many. Vishishta Dvaita classifies the selves, or the souls, in three kinds. There are three kinds of souls according to Ramanuja's philosophy, namely those that are bound by karma at all times. They've always been bound by karmas in this material world, right? They're called nitya samsaris, or bada atmas, right? They're always here, right? Those who are redeemed from samsara, who were in this material world and who've gone to liberation, right? They're called muktas it says here, redeemed from samsara through the acharya's grace and also the grace of God, right? They are called muktas, or liberated souls. And those who were always free, or eternally free of samsara, of this material world, right? And are permanently staying in Vaikuntha, the heaven of Lord Sriman Narayana, who are called nityas, like Vishvaksena, Garuda, and Ananta, right? These are the eternal servants in Vaikuntha of Sriman Narayana. To Shankara, Adi Shankaracharya, right? The self is consciousness, knowledge, and bliss. We cannot distinguish consciousness from the substratum of consciousness, knowledge from the possession of knowledge, or bliss from the one who enjoys bliss. On the contrary, Ramanuja holds the view that the self is not merely consciousness, but the substratum of consciousness, not merely knowledge, but the one who possesses the knowledge as an essential attribute. In this way, Ramanuja's conception of the self differs from that of Shankara. It is the conviction of Ramanuja that the self is not merely a knower, but also a doer. The doership of the self is not accepted by Shankara. The Jiva, or the Jivatman, the individual self, according to Ramanuja, is not all-pervading or vibhu or huge, but is atomic, is very small. The idea of the self as an all-pervading agent is not comparable with scriptural assertions, and that it goes out of the body and enters into some other body. The Jiva, described by Ramanuja, is eternal and immutable. It has no beginning, middle, or end. It does not undergo any change or parinama. Parinama means change, right? Although it is eternal and immutable, it always depends on God. It is inseparably related to God. And this relation is called apitak siddhi. When Brahman is as a substance, Brahman is substance, the Jiva is its attribute or guna. It's related to the Supreme. If Brahman is the master, the self or the individual soul is the servant. If Brahman is the whole, the self is the part. If Brahman is the dictator, the self is the dictated. Although it has been of its own accord, it always is dependent upon Brahman, the Supreme Brahman, God. According to him, Jiva is pure and perfect in its intrinsic nature, but when it conducts its activities with spiritual discipline like Saranagati or surrender, it overcomes the limitations of matter and gets restored to its natural status, that is, a pure soul. In its natural status, it finds its place in Vaikuntha, the abode of the Lord, lives eternally and enjoys the bliss in the presence of the Lord. Pillai Lokacharya, a great Sri Vaishnava Tengalai Acharya, says that there are 4 stages of Saranagati or surrender, wherein 4 obstacles occur. The 4 stages are Jnanadasa, Varnadasa, Praptadasa, and Praptyanubhavadasa. In Jnanadasa, Ajnana or ignorance will obstruct. In Varnadasa, Apurti will obstruct, incompletion. Ajnana means ignorance, Apurti means incompletion. In Praptidasa, Arti will obstruct our desire for gain, right? And in Praptyanubhavadasa, Abhinivesha will obstruct. This will all be explained later on, I'm sure. Pillai Lokacharya further says that Ajnana or ignorance will be eradicated by the knowledge of the Acharya or the Guru or the teacher. Apurti or incompleteness will be eradicated by the completeness of Ishvara. Arti or our desires will be eradicated by his grace, by the Lord's grace, and Abhinivesha will be erased by experience. Thus, on the whole, the destiny of the soul is that everyone can attain moksha by practicing sadhana, which means a method to attain liberation. Saranagati, or surrender sadhana, is an easy and within the reach of everyone with sadhana, irrespective of caste, creed, religion, gender, time, place, etc., by constant faith in God. In the next chapter, it is proposed to survey the historical development of the notions of Saranagati from the time of the Vedas to the period of the Alvars.
Om Namo Narayana